Alright, it's time to do another game. This one's called the Tower Defense. The overall goal of this game is to take defending things that are called towers and place them such that they destroy enemies before the enemies get to your base. So to begin with, what I'd like to do is take a look at how to place towers. So I'm going to create a single sprite for these towers. It doesn't really matter which I pick. I'm going to make just some dummy sprites. You should actually make honest-to-goodness sprites, because that's one of the requirements for your game. So let's call this the bear sprite. And actually, why don't I center this, because he's going to be firing projectiles. He's going to create an object, and this object is going to be called, I'm going to call this the button object. The button object is going to be just sitting off to the side of the screen, and when I click on this, it's going to create an object which drags along with my mouse. When I click in a spot with a dragging object, it'll create the tower that actually fires. So I'm going to create 3 objects that all have the same sprite, but do different things. So let me create all of those. I'm going to call this the drag object. It has that sprite. And then finally, the actual tower object is going to fire. So in the button object, when I actually press on this thing, I need to create one of my drag objects. Add an event when this thing is left pressed on. So mouse, left press. This only occurs when my mouse actually is over this object and I left press on it. If I left press anywhere else on the screen, it's not going to do anything. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to create one of the drag objects, and I'll just create that in my x and y. Same thing as self.x and self.y. The drag object, his job is going to be to follow my mouse. So every step, he's going to jump to the place where my mouse is. There's actually a variable that keeps track of your mouse x and y. Those are mouse_x and mouse_y. So he's going to jump himself to that every single step. So if I go into my new room and place a button object, not a tower, a button, and run this, I click on this and it follows my mouse around. Perfect. Other things I need to do. If I click on this drag object, I need to immediately place a tower. However, there is something I have to watch out for. If I click on this button object, it'll create a drag object, but the drag object will immediately fire a mouse event down because the drag object is there and the mouse is down over it. So I have to make sure that I let up on the mouse button on the drag object before I'm allowed to place it. So in the drag, I'm going to do this by creating a variable that keeps track of whether or not I'm allowed to place this thing. So in the create, I'm going to create my own variable, canPlace, and I'm going to set it to a 0 to start with. If I do a left release over this object, so when I let up on the mouse button, I'm going to set canPlace to be a 1. So I created it at a 0. When I let up on it, it's a 1. And when I left press, the only time I'm allowed to actually place this drag object is if canPlace is equal to a 1. So only once I've let up on the drag object will it let me actually place a tower. When this happens, I think I'm going to change myself into a tower object. And yes, I will want to perform events because it's going to have alarms. So I place, left click, have a drag object, I click, and now there's a tower. Click on the button, drag object, tower, drag, tower. All right, so that allows me to place towers. Eventually, I'm going to want to go into the button and make sure I have enough score to do this. So how about firing at enemies? So I'd like to create just a simple enemy. Sure, the ghost. Call that the ghost sprite. Enemy 1 object. To begin with, I think I'm just going to have this guy follow a generic path. So I'm going to create a new path. Blink, 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 blink. You get the idea. So the enemy 1, when it's first created, is going to start moving on a path. It's going to be that path. Sure, speed of 3. At the end, I'll just have it stop. And this time, I'm going to set it to be absolute. With absolute, it means that the enemy is going to jump to where this is. So if I throw an enemy in here, notice I placed it up here above the button object. There he goes. If I move the enemy over here, he jumps back to the same spot. All right, so the tower object is going to need to create bullets if the enemy is nearby. I need a bullet, so let me create that real quick. I'm going to center this. And while I'm thinking about it, let's center the ghost as well, so it fires at the middle of this guy. And I'll create an object called the bullet object. Bullet object has that sprite. All right. This tower is going to continually fire bullets if there's an enemy nearby. Regardless of whether there's an enemy nearby, I need to continually fire the alarms, though, that check. So when this guy is first created, I'm going to set an alarm. I'm going to fire every second just for now. When that alarm goes off, I'm going to reset the alarm to 30. And now I need to do the check to see if the enemy is nearby. There is a function that exists in GameMaker called distance to object. So if the distance to object enemy 1 underscore O is smaller than, let's say, 100. I'm going to create a bullet object here. Now, there's something that's a little bit tricky here. I actually have to watch out. If I say enemy 1 underscore O, it'll work if there's only one enemy. If there's multiple enemies, though, this is going to cause me problems. I'll get back to this issue in just a second. So to begin with, I'm going to create a bullet object at my x and y. The speed, sure, 10. Direction. What direction do I want it to go? Well, I want it to go towards the enemy, whatever that is. Point underscore direction. If you give a x and y value where you're starting, which in our case is x comma y, and then the place you're trying to get to, enemy 1 underscore o dot x, enemy 1 underscore o dot y, and then close your parenthesis. So all of this goes in the same function. This is very long. It will give you back the direction you're trying to get from this x and y to this x and y. So the bullet will go towards enemy 1. Let's see what that does. Place a tower over here. Place a tower over here. All right, so it fires only when it's nearby, and it goes towards that enemy. All right, so what happens if we have a regular group of guys going out? Well, I need to alter this a little bit so that it doesn't just fixate on enemy 1. It actually goes towards the nearest one. I think I'm going to create a variable to do this. And nearest is going to be instance nearest of enemy 1 underscore O. And that'll save off which enemy is the nearest one in the variable nearest. By the way, if you're wondering where I'm coming up with all these things, it's actually in the help file. Let's see, instance nearest. If I go to the index and take a look, down here towards the bottom, instance nearest. So I need an x, a y, and an object. So I need x and y, because that's the tower's x and y, of this kind of enemy. And now, in place of enemy and 1 underscore O, I'm going to say nearest. And similarly, in here, I'm going to say nearest.x and nearest.y. It looks like it's behaving the same way, but if I throw multiple enemies in here, then it'll behave differently.